I used to believe that hard work was enough. That if you gave your heart and soul to something, the world would eventually reward you. I was wrong. The world doesn't care how hard you work, it only cares how easily you can be broken. 2 years ago, I was on top of everything. Senior project manager at one of the fastest growing firms in New York. Big office, great team, respect from everyone. My parents were proud, my friends envied me, and my boss called me the company's future. I thought I had made it. Then came Ethan Ward. He was charming, ambitious, the kind of guy who could talk his way out of a hurricane. I helped him settle in when he joined our firm, showed him how things worked, gave him advice, even covered for him when he made rookie mistakes. I considered him a friend. That was my first mistake. It started small, missed credit on a project presentation, small rumors about my attitude. I brushed it off. But then, during one of our biggest contracts, a deal worth millions, confidential design documents were leaked to a competitor. The next morning, my inbox was flooded with accusations. HR called me in. They said my system login was used to download and send the files. I swore I didn't do it. I begged them to check deeper. But the evidence was too clean, too perfect. Emails, timestamps, everything pointed at me. Ethan sat beside me in that meeting, pretending to be shocked. I can still see his face, fake concern mixed with satisfaction. He even put a hand on my shoulder and whispered, "Man, I'll do what I can to help you." That was the last day I set foot in that office. The company fired me immediately. My reputation was destroyed overnight. Industry blogs picked it up, LinkedIn blew up with speculation, and I went from rising star to corporate traitor in less than 24 hours. My friends stopped answering my calls. My parents couldn't even look at me. I spent months in silence. Depression, anxiety, anger, they consumed me. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his smug face sitting across from me, watching me fall apart. One night, sitting in my dark apartment surrounded by empty bottles and unpaid bills, I saw a post online. Ethan had been promoted. He was now leading the same project I was supposed to finish. The comments praised him as a visionary leader who saved the company from a data breach. That's when something inside me broke. I didn't want justice. Justice was too soft, too pure for what I felt. I wanted him to suffer, to feel the exact humiliation, the same isolation that he forced on me. But I couldn't just barge in and expose him. No one would believe me, and I was already the disgraced ex-employee. So I waited. I watched. I studied. Revenge, I realized, isn't about rage. It's about patience. For the next 6 months, I rebuilt myself, quietly. I moved cities, changed my name on social media, started freelancing under a new identity. Slowly, I began connecting with people inside the company again, people who didn't know who I used to be. I found out Ethan had climbed fast, maybe too fast. He'd made enemies. He was reckless with women, money, and power. And that's when I saw my opening. Through one of my new clients for data analytics startup, I learned the firm Ethan now led was seeking external consultants for a security overhaul. I made sure I got the job. Different name, new credentials, fresh identity. Nobody recognized me. When I walked into that office again, 2 years after being fired, no one looked twice. But when I saw him, Ethan, standing there in his tailored suit, charming as ever, my hands clenched so hard I almost broke the pen I was holding. He didn't recognize me. Not yet. As he smiled and shook my hand, introducing himself like we were strangers, I smiled back. My heart was steady, my mind calm. Inside, though, I whispered to myself, this is where it begins. When you study someone long enough, you stop seeing them as a person and start seeing the pattern that made them dangerous. Ethan's pattern was arrogance folded over insecurity, of a man who performed confidence because he couldn't afford to feel anything else. He surrounded himself with sycophants who echoed his ideas, and he carved enemies from anyone who didn't laugh at his jokes. That arrogance became my map. My first objective was to become useful. Useful people are invisible until you need them, and then they become indispensable. Over the next few weeks, I learned everything I could about the current security overhaul, the vendors, the deadlines, the personalities. I sat in meetings with a badge that belonged to another name and smiled while taking notes with hands that remembered how to build a life from scratch. Ethan's weaknesses weren't technical. He was clever with optics, not with details. He trusted appearances, press releases, polished slides, late-night dinners where deals were sealed with champagne. He trusted people who made him look good. So I started to make him look spectacular. I volunteered for late-night tests. I showed up early and stayed late. I fixed minor bugs that no one else noticed. I created charts that made his strategies appear prophetic. I sent him private emails congratulating him on saving the rollout before it even launched. He basked in it. He began to rely on the new consultant who seemed to read outcomes the way others read horoscopes. That consultant was me. Once you're in, everything becomes possible. I cultivated allies in corners where secrets lived, the junior sysadmin who had a gambling problem, the procurement manager who liked to accept expensive trips in exchange for speedier approvals, the public relations intern who feared being buried under Ethan's next press cycle. I didn't bribe them at first. I offered something cheaper: respect and attention. People who had been ignored their whole careers value being seen like a forgotten masterpiece. They talked, and what they revealed fit together into a damning mosaic of greed and shortcuts. There were small, delicious things at first. An email I routed so it landed in Ethan's inbox after he walked away from a meeting. A calendar event I nudged so his most important client would clash with a crucial presentation. I didn't destroy him overnight. I nudged the world gently so it would betray him on its own. The plan had 3 phases. Phase 1: erode his credibility slowly by exposing the soft seams in his empire of missed deadlines, misallocated budgets, a board member quietly asking questions they hadn't asked before. Phase 2: make the board panic by feeding them a narrative so specific it couldn't be dismissed as coincidence. Phase 3: deliver the final humiliation, something public, irrevocable, a headline that would hang on his career like a noose. I needed allies for every phase and ammunition for the final act. The sysadmin, Marco, was the first to be useful in a way I'd anticipated. He trusted numbers and short-term wins. He'd already been disciplined once for a late payroll glitch. He was terrified of losing his house. I played on that fear in private conversations. If you ever needed someone to back you up when things went south, I'd have your back. I didn't promise anything I couldn't deliver. I promised only a partnership. I would share proof when the right time came. He wanted safety. I wanted access. We both got what we wanted. Procurement was more complex. Dana, who signed vendor contracts, loved to be the insider who knew the promotions before anyone else. I told her about a secret consultancy, my consultancy, that offered steep discounts for early commitment. Her eyes lit up. She saw the perk, the advantage, the power. She approved an expedited contract with a small clause that allowed for a phantom subcontractor. That clause would be the thread I pulled to reveal the whole tapestry later. The PR intern, little Jenna, was the sweetest and most dangerous weapon. She wanted validation more than money. She wanted praise from Ethan. She scribbled notes about the hero of the initiative and made mock releases announcing miraculous saves. She posted drafts in a shared folder with liberal comments like we should mention sales impact. Ethan deserves credit. I copied those drafts, saved timestamps, and watched the way the narrative formed. Not a team effort, not a company pivot, but Ethan's redemption arc, one man martyring himself for the company. That narrative would become his coffin, but patience is a hunger. The first month I had to bite my tongue while Ethan laughed in my presence, clapped me on the back, and introduced me to colleagues like I was a novelty. That was the hardest part, pretending to belong when I wanted to tear everything open. I learned to smile until the muscles ached. I learned when to laugh and when to lean in so people would whisper secrets when they thought no one was listening. Then I found the most dangerous thing. His ego had a ledger. Ethan kept a private folder of wins, screenshots of emails where he coaxed clients into praising him, photos from awards nights, notes about payoffs and favors. He collected evidence of his own myth-making. He hoarded praise like a squirrel hoards acorns, and he hid it because he knew how vulnerable his castle was. I didn't need to hack into the folder. I watched him drop it like a loose coin. He sensed it to a cloud backup during a thunderstorm when the office power flickered, and someone predictably careless left the laptop open on a bench at the company lounge. Marco, the sysadmin with a mortgage, saw it and remembered my "I have your back" conversation. The folder found its way into a thumb drive that didn't belong to anyone but everyone would assume was an anonymous whistleblower's. I left no fingerprints. I left no trail. I left only the idea of a trail. And that idea is what people fear most. The night I planted the drive on the press clerk's desk, I stood across the street in my rental car and watched the building hum. Ethan's office lights were a constellation. He had no idea a storm was forming. I didn't either, not yet. What I had was a match and a pile of carefully stacked tinder when the press clerk opened the file the next morning. The world reacted the way I'd hoped, to curiosity first, then hunger, then the kind of outrage that eats reputations alive. The folder contained drafts of speeches where Ethan claimed accolades for projects that were collaborative, spreadsheets with adjusted numbers, and a most deliciously evil line item hinting at a personal expense routed through a vendor. Nothing illegal on its face, but everything suggestive when combined with a pattern of grandstanding. Spun into overload. The board called a meeting to discuss the allegations. Ethan looked cornered for the first time in his life. I watched him on the live stream, the camera catching the micro expressions that always betray a man who believed himself invulnerable. He sputtered. He blamed miscommunications, called the documents private drafts, and demanded a forensic audit. The board obliged, a defensive move that buys time and legitimacy. Time is a weapon when you know how to use it. But the neat part of my plan was this: an audit requires a trail. It requires people to testify. It requires those who know to open their mouths in front of lawyers. People with mortgages and pride and loyalty to no one but themselves start to sweat when lawyers ask questions. Marco hired a lawyer hesitant to dig too deep. Dana suddenly remembered another contract with a similar clause and began to regret the line she'd signed in confidence. Jenna, nervous and pale, confessed she'd seen Ethan thin-sliced contributions into a single narrative. Once they began to speak, the story became larger than any spreadsheet. Ethan accused me of orchestrating the smear. He called me vindictive and shallow. He tried to brand me as a disgruntled outsider. He was right about one thing: I was vindictive. I embraced that word and let it warm me like a cloak. I had been burning for 2 years. Now I was the arsonist with a blueprint. I didn't ignite a forest fire. I lit a controlled burn that would spread only where dry brush had been left unattended. I baited the board with specific questions. Who approved the subcontractor? Why were quarterly reports adjusted after client calls? And they bit. I fed them corroboration, internal emails, the mock press releases, the vendor close I'd had Dana sign. Each piece alone was inconclusive. Together they painted the picture of a man who had built an empire of optics and left the foundations rotted. He tried to fight back the way bullies fight, louder and with bluster. He sent a PR statement denouncing the anonymous leak. He called an emergency town hall and read a speech about loyalty and hard decisions. He looked like a man remembering lines from a play he'd practiced, but practiced lines looked brittle under pressure. People who had admired him now watched from a distance. And yet, a part of me knew vengeance isn't a single triumph. It's a series of fractures that eventually collapse into one inevitable fall. I had to be careful. A reckless move could make me the arsonist of my own life. So I waited, patient and surgical, letting the dominoes line up until all that was left was the final finger to knock them down. When an audit becomes a mirror, the first thing people try to do is look away. For Ethan, that instinct came as anger, fast, loud, theatrical. He called emergency meetings, printed glossy rebuttals, and leaned on the two things that had always kept him afloat: charisma and misdirection. But charisma only stretches so far against paper trails and sworn statements. Missteps that had once read like clever improvisation now looked like deliberate edits. The board's patience, already fraying, tightened into something clinical. The auditors arrived with faces that betrayed nothing. They shuffled through files like surgeons, precise and indifferent. They asked questions that sounded innocent. Who approved this invoice? Was this expense reconciled? Why was this report revised after client feedback? Each question was a probe. Each probe made someone's hands tremble. I watched from the edges of the chaos with an attention that felt eerily calm. The company's nerve endings were exposed, and every flinch telegraphed a weakness I could exploit. Leah, the analyst who'd slipped me the packet, started showing up at odd hours, jittery, eyes hollowed from late nights, but determined. She'd find little tines an email chain where Ethan had suggested simplifying contributor credits. A calendar entry that showed he'd moved a deliverable deadline to suit a client's public announcement. These were not explosive on their own, but together they began to form a rhythm: omissions, manipulations, A man composing reality for his own benefit. Publicly, Ethan performed contrition with the practiced vulnerability of an actor reading a script he'd written. Private meetings told another story. He raged at his team. He made threats that were more about sound than follow-through. "You'll regret this," he told a procurement manager with pale lips. "You'll wish you'd never touched those papers." Threats are a performance. Fear is their applause. Some people walked a little straighter after he spoke. Others, Marco among them, looked as if they'd aged 5 years in one night. The press smelled blood. A national tech outlet ran a cautious piece about internal lapses in the industry's hottest companies. It included a quote from an anonymous insider that read like an invitation. Social feeds filled with thinly sourced commentary. I knew the tempo of public fascination, initial curiosity, then scandal, then relentless appetite. The board tried to control the rhythm by releasing statements that emphasized audit, transparency, and process. But releasing statements is like shouting into a canyon. An echo returns, and you can't control its shape. Night after night, I sat at my desk after everyone left and watched the red digits of my phone glow with messages I'd planted through channels I'd cultivated. Anonymous tips. A forwarded photograph. A screenshot of a private message with Ethan's name on it, cavalier, triumphant. I checked them like a gambler checking a table crease, feeling both dread and exhilaration. Each minor victory was a stone I dropped into the pond, watching concentric rings spread outward. Then came the first admission. Not from Ethan, but from someone who had once admired him, Jenna, the PR intern. She'd been terrified of being the one to speak, convinced she'd be marginalized or fired for telling the truth. But the auditors asked questions that made confidentiality less comforting. Legal frameworks chew up fear and spit out testimony. In a deposition, Jenna said something I'd already known in my bones. Ethan curated his own legend. He rewrote contributions. He funneled praise into a narrative thread that made him the protagonist of every success. Her words didn't immediately make headlines. Depositions are dry and dull to the public ear, but the board received the transcript, and the board is a body that loves clarity. They began to ask what they hadn't asked before. Where did the money flow? Who benefited? And were reputational goods being traded for closet favors? The questions widened like cracks in plaster. Where plaster is thin, wind gets in. Ethan started to show real cracks. He stopped telling jokes. He would not meet my eyes when we passed in corridors. Once, in a glass-walled conference room, I watched him try to speak and then swallow whatever he'd intended to say. Power is a kind of muscle. When it atrophies, movement becomes awkward. He showed up to a client presentation and mispronounced the name of the very product he championed. The room felt the stutter like a missed beat in a song everyone thought they knew. People exchanged glances. The atmosphere tasted like caution. I meddled where I needed to, an innocuous suggestion here, a forwarded document there, a private complaint prodded toward HR. But the core work was already doing itself. People who had been bullheaded in their loyalty suddenly considered their futures. Those with families and mortgages, Marco, Dana, were practical. They wanted to survive. Those with reputation to protect were afraid of being tarred by association. And fear, more than truth, convinced them to name things out loud. Then the leak that made the press actually care arrived. A whistleblower uploaded a curated selection of documents to a public repository. The selection was surgical, a messy ledger of expenses tied to an external PR firm. A set of emails where client wins were framed as singular feats. And a PDF of Ethan's private folder draft speeches, clippings, and notes that smelled like ego. The leak was anonymous, but its timing matched the audit's pressure points so precisely it could have been choreographed by someone inside the firm who knew the audit's rhythm. Journalists called. The story moved from niche trade press to national outlets. The public reaction was immediate and brutal. Headlines framed Ethan as the architect of a manufactured glory. Twitter had its feast. Former clients issued statements about misaligned expectations. Vendors wrung their hands and quietly offered cooperation with investigators to distance themselves from the scandal. The board convened. Emergency sessions are on the clock. Share prices already jittery skidded like a car on ice. For a man whose life was a billboard, the billboard came crashing down. But collapse is a messy business. In the days that followed the leak, Ethan lashed out in ways that blurred moral lines. He attempted to discredit witnesses, implying their testimony came from grudges or jealousy. He called in favors with journalists, spinning a defense that depended on nuance and context. He begged allies on the board to give him the chance to clear this up. There was pleading in his voice now, an animal sound that once would have felt foreign to him. One night, when the office had mostly emptied and the cleaning crew hummed in the background, he cornered me by the elevators. His face was pale. His voice was low. "Who are you?" he asked, suddenly less an emperor and more a man in the dark. He searched for my past in the lines of my face, hoping to find the familiar, the disposable, scapegoat. He found nothing. For a moment he seemed genuinely terrified, no script to cover him. I told him nothing. That silence became its own weapon. He flung accusations like darts, wild, fast, dissipating into air. He tried intimidation, the last and most impotent tool of a man losing everything that once made people obey him. People are easily cowed, but you can't intimidate the truth. As avenues narrowed for him, Athens' choices grew desperate. He started surveilling his team, sponsoring internal investigations with shadow consultants, and pushing to discredit anyone who might testify. In those efforts he showed his true moral geography, a country where loyalty is bought and sold, where outcomes justify the means. Watching him turn his office into a nest of suspicion felt like watching someone attempt to barricade a house already aflame. And then, the most delicate fracture, his personal life, reputation, and intimacy are braided. When one strand fails, the other soon follows. A past relationship, an ex who had once been silenced by a glossy agreement to protect the company's image, decided she would no longer be quiet. She came forward with messages and receipts that suggested Athens' public displays of leadership had sometimes involved private exchanges of favors. Her courage, small and private, added texture to what had been an otherwise technical scandal. It made him look less like a clever executive and more like a man trading ethics for advantage. It all added up to a cascade. The board, facing fiduciary risk and public fury, voted to suspend Ethan pending further review. The announcement was clinical, stripped of melodrama, but it landed like a blade. For a few minutes after the statement went out, the office felt like a war zone where both sides had paused to check their wounds. I felt nothing in those minutes but a cold, odd relief. Revenge is a slow chemistry experiment. Sometimes you don't feel the heat until you smell the result. Watching him escorted from the floor by security head Bode, defenders few felt less like triumph than a completion of a ledger I had been balancing against my own life. He would not be destroyed overnight. There would be legal fights, apologies, and perhaps a resurrection of sorts. But his pedestal had been shattered, and the people who once fed his legend had turned their backs. They called it the rebuttal. He called it a counterstrike. The lawyers called it messy. Whatever you named it, it arrived like a thunderclap. Athens' legal team, smiling and immaculate, filed a suit accusing the company of negligence and named a suspect in the leak and a named former employee with a motive. They painted a picture of a disgruntled man, a loose cannon with access and a grudge. The insinuation was obvious. The world has a way of loving symmetry. People prefer stories where the villain is obvious and the hero is tidy. I'd given them ambiguity. I built a story of consequence, and he weaponized that ambiguity into doubt. Suddenly, reporters called me. Anonymous tips turned into pointed questions. My name, the new name I'd cultivated, rattled like a coin in a slot machine. Someone dug up a freelance byline from months ago and asked whether that byline belonged to the same person who'd been fired 2 years earlier. The old narrative, the one where I was a disgraced traitor, started threatening to stitch itself back together like a revenant. Panic is a slow leak in a boat. It starts invisible, and then, with a single bad night, you find yourself wading in cold water. My phone buzzed with texts from numbers I didn't recognize. A conservative news podcast speculated about internal sabotage. A legal blog suggested that the leak might be an attempt to sabotage a rising executive. Classic revenge. The board, already raw, convened and swiveled its eyes to the one man who'd reappeared around the edges of their scandal. Trust is a fungible thing. When the ledger is bloodied, people trade it like currency. I could have walked away. I could have let the story die under legal filings and corporate press statements. The safety of obscurity had its appeal. I felt its pull like the tide. But revenge had become a different animal in me, not merely the desire to see him fall, but the compulsion to prove that my fall had been engineered, that my life had been savaged for sport. So I stopped being invisible. I stepped into the light in the way a predator steps into view, calculated, and hurried. I reached out to a former colleague at a rival paper who owed me a favor and I fed them a thread. Financial anomalies. A vendor with ties to board members. A paid PR campaign that smelled like laundering image for profit. I leaked another document, this one carefully redacted so that only the pattern remained, not the hand that had placed it there. The press inhaled. The angle shifted from an anecdote about a fallen exec to a broader tale of systemic rot. Ethan retaliated in kind. He launched a defamation suit naming me as the anonymous leaker and, for maximum theater, included screenshots of my freelance bylines and a lawyer's note suggesting possible criminal charges. He wanted me to blink. He wanted me to fold and disappear into the narrative that favored him. The first court date loomed like a guillotine, but legal fights are less about truth than they are about stamina. My opponents had money, clean suits, and a talent for making moral panic sound like public interest. I had time, a kind of bitter creativity, and a handful of allies who owed debts that had nothing to do with loyalty, only mutual interest. Leah agreed to testify. Marco produced server logs that had been mysteriously misplaced during the company's internal review. Dana, her face pale but steady, admitted she'd signed contracts without reading the fine print because Ethan made her feel special. Each testimony was a minor surgery, reopening old wounds, but stitching toward exposure. The hearings became theater. Journalists camped outside the courthouse. Ethan's ex went on the record and spoke with a tremor in her voice that was both brave and devastating. The courtroom was hot with the smell of cheap cologne and legal pads. I sat in the back, hands clenched, and watched the man who'd once been my executioner perform shock and sorrow by turns. He insisted he'd been a victim of a smear campaign. He said the documents were selectively leaked and misinterpreted. He played wounded dignity like an instrument and people leaned forward to listen. There were moments brief, flammable when vengeance looked like vindication. A judge compelled the firm to turn over emails. A subpoena revealed drafts where Ethan had rephrased team credits into single-author triumphs. A vendor produced invoices that connected payments to a shell firm with the same director listed in a little-known corporate registry. The reporters who'd earlier danced around the edges moved in for a full embrace. For a second, the world felt balanced. The scales tipped, but the deep cut of revenge is how it changes the surgeon. I could see it in the small ways, the nights I woke with my heart racing for no reason. The way I flinched when a door closed behind me. The way I started preemptively crafting narratives to deflect any suggestion of impropriety in my own past. The city, which had once felt like a stage for my comeback, now felt like an echo chamber of my sins. Ethan's team found an angle that would have made lesser men crumble. They suggested that the leak had been engineered not just to expose his misdeeds, but to create career opportunities for the leaker. It was a maliciously plausible narrative. What if I'd leaked the documents to propel myself back into relevance? They asked. What if this was a performance designed to reinsert the wrong protagonist into a flock of sympathetic reporters? It was deliciously cynical and journalists loved a neat, scandalous theory. Then something unexpected happened. A source someone I had not courted and certainly not controlled came forward with a memory I hadn't anticipated, the night Ethan had confided, tipsy and boasting, about how far he'd go to keep his image clean. The source was a bartender from an awards event, a quiet man who'd washed glasses for years and listened more than most realized. His testimony was small and human. Ethan had bragged about smoothing over sticky situations with creative paperwork and strategic generosity. It was not a smoking gun, but it was atmosphere, and atmosphere is contagious in a courtroom. We trudged through depositions, each one a striptease of ego and accountability. The strain showed on every face involved. Leah's hands trembled on the stand. Marco looked hollowed out. Dana kept her eyes slightly downcast as if she expected disapproval to rain from above. Sometimes I wondered which of us had the right to feel righteous. We had all been compromised in small ways, each playing roles that benefited someone else. That moral grayness was the real damage. Outside the courthouse, the tabloids ran with narratives that distorted facts into easier stories. Social media took both sides and chewed them into memes. There were days when the line between truth and performance blurred so completely I could no longer tell if the courtroom drama reflected reality or helped create it. My story had become a feedback loop. And then the most dangerous escalation, someone tried to break into my apartment. It wasn't violent. It was sloppy. Drawers rifled, an old laptop pulled from a bag, papers left in a scatter as if the intruder had been interrupted. The police, slow, polite, skeptical, took a report and said the most likely motive was intimidation. Whoever had come was careful enough to avoid fingerprints but careless enough to draw attention. I slept that night with the lights on and the curtains open, as if visibility could be a shield. I called Leah, who was frantic. They called my mother, she said. They said things about what I'll lose if I testify. Threats started to feel real, not abstract. The company that had once been an office with coffee machines and meeting rooms now resembled an organism with teeth. The fight had left its safety zone and moved into the places we had thought were private, our homes, our families, our quieter lives. That was the moment I understood the true cost. Revenge is not a single strike. It is a contagion. It spreads, and sometimes the only thing you can do is hold the fever long enough to see what it consumes. My parents, who had once recoiled from me in shame, began to send messages of tentative support. My sister wrote one-line texts, "Stay safe. Call if you need cash." The human gestures were small but real, and they landed like cool water on the parts of me that had been singed. The court battles droned on. The press cycles recalibrated. Ethan remained defiant, sometimes blunt, sometimes desperate, but cornered men get creative. He tried to turn the narrative into one of redemption, claiming he had been scapegoated by a cultural hunger for villains. He said he'd been human, flawed, but committed to learning. Some people bought it. Some always buy hope. Late one night, in the quiet between hearings, I found myself at the window of my temporary apartment, watching traffic stitch itself into lines of light. I realized with a clarity that was both terrifying and cold that this would not end cleanly. There would be settlements and apologies that read like confessions but said nothing. There would be reputations scrubbed and reputations rebuilt. There would be an aftermath filled with small and satisfying reparations, and beneath it all, a darker truth. In cutting him down, I had opened doors in myself that I had not known were locked. I had learned how to be patient, how to lie low, how to coax a confession from a system by pulling a single string. That knowledge sits in my hands now like a loaded instrument. It comforts me, because I can shape outcomes. It frightens me, because I recognize the ease with which power can corrupt. The Monday morning of the final hearing felt too quiet. The city outside my window was gray and damp, the kind of weather that blurs edges and dulls nerves. I dressed mechanically, black suit, pressed shirt, no tie. My reflection looked older than I remembered, and I wondered when that had happened. Maybe somewhere between the first betrayal and the first headline. By then, the case had metastasized beyond both of us. The media called it the collapse of a corporate saint. Ethan's name trended daily. His photos were dissected for signs of guilt or redemption. And me. I was the whistleblower, the exiled employee, the man who came back. Labels temporary, convenient, shallow. No one wanted to know the years between the fall and the return, only the blood on the floor now. Inside the courthouse, Dare was charged. Cameras clicked as we walked past the barricades. Ethan was flanked by his lawyers and PR handler. He looked composed, practiced, maybe even tranquil. When our eyes met, there was no hatred left, only exhaustion. To men who'd burned too long to feel the heat anymore, the final argument wasn't about evidence anymore. It was about perception. The jury had seen enough proof of corporate rot, enough contradictions in his story, to know the truth lived somewhere in the middle. The question was which truth they wanted to believe. His lawyer spoke about ambition, about the cruelty of modern media, about how one mistake shouldn't define a lifetime of achievement. My attorney spoke about patterns, about how power erodes morality, about accountability. When the verdict came, it didn't roar, it whispered. The judge's voice was calm, almost sad. Ethan was found liable for falsifying documents and breaching fiduciary duty. The company would pay restitution to shareholders. His reputation, his empire, was effectively dismantled. The crowd murmured. Reporters rushed out. Phones buzzed with breaking news alerts. I didn't celebrate. I just sat there, staring at the floor, while people around me shook hands and whispered congratulations. Ethan stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked past me without a word. As he reached the door, he stopped just long enough to glance back. His face was unreadable, but there was something there. Not fear, not hate, recognition. The look of a man who finally understood that the person he tried to destroy had learned his methods, mastered them, and used them better. Outside, the flash of cameras blinded both of us. They swarmed him first, shouting questions, shoving microphones into his face. He didn't answer. He just pushed through, the ghost wrapped in designer fabric. When they turned to me, I said nothing. The silence was my last act of power. Over the next few months, everything unraveled for him. The firm cut ties. His friends evaporated. A documentary crew started sniffing around his downfall, but he refused interviews. There were rumors he'd left the city, rumors he'd started consulting under a fake name, rumors he'd lost everything. I never checked. I didn't need to. My own life didn't transform into redemption. It just leveled out. A new job at a smaller firm. A few careful articles under a pseudonym. Fewer friends, but the ones that stayed were real. My sister came to visit one weekend. We ate in silence most of the time, but she finally said, "You won." "Did I?" I asked. She didn't answer, and she didn't have to, because the truth was revenge doesn't end when the enemy falls. It ends when you stop needing to watch him fall. And I hadn't, not yet. Some nights I still searched his name, scrolled through old clips, reread old statements. Each time, the hit of satisfaction got smaller, thinner, like chasing a drug that doesn't work anymore. Then, one night, I saw a story buried deep on a finance blog. Former executive Ethan Cole found dead in apparent suicide. The details were sparse: empty apartment, bottle of pills, a note the police didn't disclose. I sat there, staring at the screen, feeling nothing, no joy, no relief, no horror, just the quiet awareness that the circle had finally closed. My revenge was complete, but it hadn't brought me back anything. Not my name, not my peace, only silence. I closed the laptop and looked out the window. The city was still alive: sirens, laughter, lights, the endless churn. The same world that had ruined me, rebuilt me, and ruined him. And in that noise, I understood something I'd ignored for years. We all think we're fighting to clear our names. But in truth, we're just trying to make the pain make sense. I poured myself a drink, raised it to the window, and whispered to no one, "This is the price of victory." Then I turned off the light.